When a stranger's horse went lame outside her small ranch, she didn't hesitate. She offered him her own. "Bring him back when you can," she said with a tired smile. To her, it was just a favor, a moment of kindness. But weeks later, thunder echoed down the road. A fine stallion, a carriage of gifts, and the same man returned. Only this time, he wasn't asking for help. He'd come to repay it, with a new life she never dared to dream of. The sun hung like molten iron in a sky too pale to hold it. Heat shimmered across the canyon ridge in waves that bent the world at its edges, turning stone and scrub into something liquid, unstable. Clara Wynne rode her mare slow along the crest, eyes narrowed against the glare, the brim of her hat doing little to shield the burn. The land was dying, had been dying for months. Every creek bed she passed was cracked and white, every juniper bent like an old man's spine. The wind carried no relief, only dust, fine as ash, that clung to her skin and filled her lungs with the taste of ruin. She wasn't looking for him. She was looking for water. The mare's ears flicked forward, and Clara felt the shift in her gait before she saw the reason. Down in the hollow where the dry creek used to run, something dark lay crumpled against the base of a cottonwood. At first she thought it was a coyote, then she saw the boots, the hand still gripping leather reins, and beyond him, sprawled in the dust with its neck twisted wrong, a bay horse, dead. Clara's chest tightened. She pulled the mare to a stop and sat there, breath held, while the wind hissed through the canyon like a warning. Help him and risk the little you have left. Leave him and live with what that makes you. The silence stretched. Buzzards circled high above, lazy and patient. The man didn't move. His hat had fallen beside him, and his face was turned toward the earth, as if in prayer or surrender. She couldn't tell if he was breathing. Clara dismounted slow, her boots crunching on the brittle ground. She carried her canteen in one hand, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. Half full, maybe less. Enough to get her home if she didn't waste it. Not enough if she shared. She knelt beside him and turned his head with careful fingers. His face was burned raw by the sun, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes sealed shut with dust and exhaustion. A man in his 30s, maybe. Hard to say. The desert had a way of aging people before their time. His shirt was soaked through with sweat and dirt, and when she pressed her hand to his chest, his heartbeat was faint, erratic. He was dying. Clara unscrewed the cap of her canteen and poured a thin stream over his lips. At first nothing, then his throat convulsed, and he coughed, a wet, desperate sound that made her wince. His eyes cracked open, unfocused, the color of slate in winter. "Easy," she murmured. "Easy now." He tried to speak, but the words came out broken, shapeless. She gave him another sip, then pulled back before he could take too much. He reached for the canteen with a trembling hand, but she held it away. "Not yet," she said quietly. "You'll make yourself sick." His hand dropped. His eyes found hers, and for a moment, something passed between them, gratitude or accusation, she couldn't tell. Then his gaze slid away, back toward the dead horse, and his expression crumpled. "Gone," he rasped. "She's gone." Clara glanced at the mare. Flies had already begun to gather. The animal's ribs stood out sharp beneath the hide, and its eyes were glazed and empty. It had run itself to death, or been ridden that way. Either meant desperation. "What happened?" Clara asked. The man shook his head, slow and heavy. "Storm. Got turned around. Ran out of water 2 days ago." 2 days. Clara felt the weight of that settle in her gut. 2 days without water in this heat. It was a miracle he was still breathing. She looked back toward her mare, standing patient in the dust, then down at the man again. He was too weak to stand, let alone walk. If she left him here, he'd be dead by nightfall. If she took him with her, she'd be bringing a stranger into her home, a man she knew nothing about, who might be running from something worse than thirst. The wind picked up, and dust devils spun across the canyon floor like ghosts. Clara closed her eyes and felt the sun press down on her shoulders, heavy as judgment. Then she made her choice. "Can you sit up?" she asked. He nodded, though it took him 3 tries to do it. She looped his arm over her shoulders and hauled him to his feet, staggering under his weight. He was taller than she'd expected, broader through the chest, and he smelled of sweat and leather and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or pain. She half-dragged him to the mare and braced him against the saddle while she caught her breath. "You're going to have to help me," she said. "I can't lift you alone." He gripped the saddle horn with both hands and managed to get one foot in the stirrup. It took everything he had. Clara pushed from behind, and together they got him up and into the saddle, though he slumped forward immediately, forehead pressed to the mare's neck. Clara swung up behind him, one arm around his waist to keep him steady, the other holding the reins. "What's your name?" she asked as they started moving. He didn't answer right away. She thought maybe he'd passed out. Then, quiet as the wind, he said, "Elias." "Clara," she replied. "Hold on, Elias. It's a long ride." The sun began its slow descent as they made their way back across the ridge. The sky turned gold, then amber, then the deep red of a wound. Shadows stretched long and thin, and the temperature dropped just enough to remind Clara that night was coming. The mare moved steady beneath them, her breath even, her steps sure. She'd carried heavier loads before. Clara had made sure of that. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, his head lolling against her shoulder, his breathing shallow. Every now and then he'd murmur something, a name maybe, or a fragment of a thought, but Clara couldn't make sense of it. She kept her eyes on the horizon and counted the miles in her head. By the time the first stars appeared, the wind had turned. It came from the west now, carrying the scent of rain, or the memory of it at least. Clara felt it against her face, cool and strange, and for a moment she let herself hope. But the sky remained clear, and the smell faded, and she knew it had been nothing but a trick of the air. The cabin came into view just as the last light bled out of the sky. It sat low and weathered at the base of the hills, a single lamp burning in the window like a promise. Clara had left it that way before she rode out, a beacon, in case she didn't make it back before dark. Now it felt like salvation. She pulled the mare to a stop in front of the porch and slid down, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Elias was barely conscious, his eyes half open, his skin clammy to the touch. She got him down from the saddle and into the cabin, half carrying him again, and lowered him onto the cot by the stove. He collapsed into it like a man who'd been holding himself together by sheer will, and now the last of that will had finally given out. Clara lit the other lamp and set it on the table, then filled a basin with water from the pump. She soaked a cloth and wiped the dust from his face, his neck, his hands. His skin was hot to the touch, fever already setting in. She'd seen it before, the way the body fought back after being pushed too far. Sometimes it won, sometimes it didn't. She gave him more water, slow and careful, and covered him with a blanket, even though the night wasn't cold yet. Then she sat back in the chair by the stove and watched him breathe, her own breath finally slowing to match. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, carrying dust and darkness and the distant sound of something. Maybe thunder, maybe nothing. That rattled the shutters and made the lamp flicker. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and listened. The mare was in the barn, safe and fed. The cabin was locked. There was nothing more she could do tonight. But as she sat there in the lamplight, watching the stranger's chest rise and fall, she felt the weight of what she'd done settle over her like a stone. She'd brought him here. She'd made the choice. And now, for better or worse, he was hers to keep alive. Elias stirred in his sleep, his hand twitching toward something that wasn't there. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear. Clara leaned forward, listening, but the sound was lost beneath the wind. She reached out and rested her hand on his shoulder, just for a moment, a touch meant to anchor him, or maybe herself. Then she pulled back and stood, crossing to the window to look out into the night. The storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, taste it on the wind. It wouldn't bring rain, not here, not now, but it would bring something, change maybe, or reckoning. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. By dawn, when the storm cleared, the stranger was still alive, and her peace was gone. The first light came pale and hesitant, slipping through the cracks in the shutters like something afraid of what it might find. Clara woke in the chair, her neck stiff, her body aching from a night spent half asleep and listening. The stove had gone cold. The lamp had burned out. And across the room, Elias lay still beneath a blanket, his breathing steady but shallow. She stood and crossed to the cot, her boots soft on the wooden floor. His fever had broken sometime in the night. She could see it in the way his color had returned, faint but there, and the sweat that dampened his hair and collar. He was still asleep, or near enough, his face turned toward the wall as if he didn't want to be seen. Clara placed her hand against his forehead. Cool. Not cold, but no longer burning. Relief loosened something in her chest that she hadn't realized had been clenched. She moved to the stove and rekindled the fire, then set the kettle on to boil. Coffee first, then she'd see about food. Her stomach was a hollow knot, and she knew he'd need something more than water if he was going to get his strength back. Outside, the sky was gray and low, the sun hidden behind a veil of dust that hadn't settled from the night's wind. The land looked even more barren in the morning light, stripped of shadow and softness, laid bare in all its harshness. Clara stood on the porch and looked out toward the ridge, toward the place where she'd found him, and wondered what he'd been running from, because men didn't end up in the canyon by accident. Not like that. Not alone, with a dead horse and 2 days without water. Men like that were either fleeing something or chasing it, and either way, they brought trouble with them. She went back inside and poured herself a cup of coffee, then sat at the table and stared at the steam rising from the cup. She should have left him. She knew that. It would have been safer, smarter. But she hadn't, and now he was here, and she'd have to live with that choice. Whatever it brought. Behind her, Elias stirred. She heard the rustle of the blanket, the creak of the cot as he shifted his weight. Then, quiet and rough, his voice, "Where am I?" Clara turned in her chair and met his eyes. They were clearer now, more focused, though still shadowed with exhaustion. He looked around the cabin slowly, taking in the stove, the table, the window, the door. Looking for exits maybe, or threats. "My cabin," Clara said. "About 10 miles south of the ridge." He nodded slowly, as if that made sense, though she doubted it did. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, wincing, and looked down at himself, at the blanket, the clean shirt she'd put on him after cutting away the ruined one. He frowned. "You brought me here." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "I did. Why?" She took a sip of her coffee and studied him over the rim of the cup. "Because you would have died if I didn't." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, something between gratitude and guilt. Then he looked away, down at his hands, and said nothing. "You hungry?" Clara asked. "Yeah." She stood and moved to the stove, pulling out a pan and a few strips of dried meat from the pantry. It wasn't much, but it would do. She cooked in silence, and he watched from the cot, his eyes following her movements with a kind of quiet intensity that made her uneasy. When the food was ready, she brought it to him on a tin plate, along with a cup of water. He took it with both hands, careful, and ate slowly, as if his body wasn't sure it could handle solid food yet. Clara sat back down at the table and drank her coffee, waiting. When he finished, he set the plate aside and looked at her again. "Thank you," he said. Clara nodded. "You can stay until you're strong enough to ride. Then you'll need to move on." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might argue, but he didn't. He just nodded and lay back down, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "What's your name?" he asked after a while. "Clara." "Clara," he repeated as if testing the weight of it. Then, softer, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For being trouble." Clara didn't answer. Because he was right. He was trouble. She could feel it in the way the air had changed since she'd brought him here, in the way her own instincts screamed at her to be careful, to keep her distance. But she'd made her choice, and for now, that choice was lying on her cot, breathing steady, alive. Outside, the wind picked up again, and dust began to swirl against the windows. Clara stood and crossed to the door, looking out at the gray sky, the dead land, the horizon that promised nothing but more of the same, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that the storm hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The rain came 3 days later, sudden and violent, like the sky had been holding its breath and finally let go. Clara was mending a saddle strap on the porch when the first drops hit, fat and cold, spattering against the dry wood with a sound like distant drumming. She looked up, and the clouds were rolling in from the west, black and swollen, moving fast enough that she could see their edges churning. She gathered the saddle and her tools and hurried inside just as the downpour began in earnest. The sound on the roof was deafening, a roar that swallowed every other noise, and through the window she watched the dust turn to mud, the canyon walls darken with runoff, the whole world transform in minutes from bone dry to drowning. Elias sat at the table, a cup of coffee between his hands, watching the storm with an expression she couldn't read. He'd been on his feet for 2 days now, moving slow but steady, helping where he could without being asked, chopping wood, hauling water from the pump, fixing the loose board on the barn door. He didn't talk much, only answered when spoken to, and even then, his words were careful, measured, like a man who'd learned that saying too much could cost him. Clara hung the saddle on its peg and shook the rein from her hair. The cabin felt smaller with him in it, not in a bad way, exactly, but in a way that made her aware of every movement, every breath, every moment of silence that stretched between them. "Never seen rain come that fast," Elias said, his voice low enough that it barely carried over the storm. "It doesn't, usually," Clara replied. She moved to the stove and added another log to the fire, though the cabin was already warm. "When it does rain out here, it takes its time. This is different." "Different how?" She paused, staring into the flames. Like something broke, he didn't respond to that. But when she glanced back at him, he was still watching the window, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. She wondered what he saw out there, what memories the storm pulled up from whatever past he was running from. Clara poured herself coffee and sat across from him. The lamp between them flickered with each gust of wind that rattled the shutters. Outside, the world had turned gray and formless, the rain so thick it erased the horizon. "You ever going to tell me what happened out there?" she asked. Elias's eyes shifted to her, sharp and sudden, like she'd touched something raw. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he looked back down at his cup and spoke quietly. "Got separated from my route. Storm hit harder than I expected. Horse couldn't take it." "Your route," Clara repeated. "You a traitor? Was, and now?" He shook his head. "Now I'm just trying to get north." "North to where?" "Doesn't matter." Clara leaned back in her chair, studying him. There was more he wasn't saying, a lot more, but she didn't push. Men carried secrets the way the land carried scars, and some things weren't meant to be dug up. Still, the not knowing sat between them like a third presence, heavy and watchful. "You planning to stay long?" she asked. "Just until the weather clears. Then I'll be gone. You don't have a horse. I'll walk if I have to." Clara sipped her coffee and said nothing. She'd seen men walk into the desert before. Most of them didn't come back. The rain continued through the afternoon and into the evening, relentless, turning the ground outside into a river of mud. Clara cooked a simple supper, beans and cornbread, and they ate in silence, the sound of the storm filling the space where conversation might have been. Afterward, Elias insisted on cleaning the dishes, and Clara didn't argue. She sat by the fire and worked on the saddle strap again, her hands moving by memory while her mind wandered. She thought about the last time someone else had been in this cabin. Her husband Daniel, 2 years gone now. Fever took him in the winter, fast and cruel, and she'd buried him on the hill behind the house where the wind didn't reach. She hadn't spoken his name aloud since. The cabin had been quiet after that, too quiet. She'd gotten used to it, or thought she had, but now with Elias here, she realized how much the silence had weighed on her, how much easier it was to breathe when there was another person's presence to push back against the emptiness. But easier didn't mean safe. When the dishes were done, Elias stood by the window and stared out into the dark. The rain had softened to a steady patter, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low and lazy, like the storm was settling in for the night. "You live out here alone?" he asked. "I do. That's hard. It's what I have." He nodded slowly, still facing the window. "You ever think about leaving? Where would I go? Town. Somewhere with people." Clara smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "People are harder than the land." Elias turned to look at her then, and something in his expression softened. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They are." They stood there in the lamplight, the fire crackling behind them, the rain drumming above, and for a moment, Clara felt the weight of the unspoken things between them. The questions she wouldn't ask, the answers he wouldn't give, the fragile trust that was forming despite both of them knowing better. "You should get some rest," she said finally. "You're still healing. So should you." "I will," but she didn't, not right away. After Elias settled onto the cot and turned his face to the wall, Clara stayed by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the rhythm of his breathing slow and deepen. She thought about the way he'd looked at the storm, like he was seeing ghosts in the rain. She thought about the scars on his hands, old ones, the kind that came from work and wear, but newer ones too, rough and red, like rope burn or worse. She thought about the wanted posters she'd seen nailed to the post outside the general store the last time she'd ridden into town. Faded and weathered, most of them. Faces she didn't recognize and crimes she didn't care about. But there were always new ones, always men on the run. Clara closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. She was a fool for keeping him here, she knew that. But she'd made her choice, and she'd see it through, at least until the rain stopped and he could leave. She just hoped that would be soon enough. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of rain that turned the valley into a bog, the paths into streams, the sky into a ceiling of bruised gray that never lifted. Clara and Elias moved around each other in the small space of the cabin like dancers who'd learned the steps without speaking. She at the stove or the table, he by the window or the woodpile, both of them careful not to crowd, not to ask too much. On the second day, he helped her reinforce the barn door against the wind. They worked side by side in the rain, their clothes soaked through, their hands slipping on wet wood, but they got it done. Afterward, Clara made hot coffee, and they sat by the fire, shivering and silent, while their clothes dried and the warmth seeped back into their bones. On the third day, she taught him how to braid leather straps for the saddle harness, and he picked it up quick, his fingers deft and sure. He didn't say much, but she noticed the way his shoulders relaxed as he worked, the way the tension in his jaw eased. It was the first time she'd seen him look almost at peace. On the fourth day, the rain finally began to ease. The clouds thinned, and shafts of pale light broke through, turning the wet earth silver. Clara stood on the porch and breathed in the smell of it, rain and soil and something green trying to push through. It felt like the world had exhaled. Elias came to stand beside her, his arms crossed, his gaze on the horizon. "I should go," he said. Clara didn't look at him. "You don't have a horse. I'll manage. You'll die." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, softer, "Maybe." Clara turned to face him. His profile was sharp against the pale sky, his jaw set, his eyes shadowed. He looked like a man who'd already made up his mind, and she knew there was nothing she could say to change it. "Wait one more day," she said. "Let the ground dry out. I'll ride into town tomorrow and see if anyone's selling." He looked at her then, surprise flickering across his face. "You don't have to do that." "I know." "Why would you?" Clara met his gaze and held it. "Because you saved my mare from carrying a dead man. That's worth something." His throat worked, and for a moment she thought he might argue. But he didn't. He just nodded, slow and uncertain, and looked away. "Thank you," he said, and the words sounded like they cost him. Clara turned back to the valley, to the silver light spreading across the wet earth, and felt something shift inside her. Something she couldn't name, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Don't thank me yet," she said quietly. That night, the fire burned low, and the cabin settled into the kind of stillness that comes after a storm. Clara lay in her bed on the far side of the room, staring at the ceiling, while Elias slept on the cot near the stove. His breathing was even, calm, but she couldn't find sleep herself. She kept thinking about the way he'd looked when she'd offered to help, like he didn't know what to do with kindness, like it was something foreign, something dangerous. She wondered what kind of life made a man forget how to accept help. And she wondered, not for the first time, what she was really doing, keeping him here, offering him a way forward. Was it mercy, or was it loneliness? Was she helping him, or was she just trying to fill the silence that had been pressing down on her for 2 years? Clara didn't have an answer, so she closed her eyes and listened to the sound of his breathing, and eventually, somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, she slept. When she woke, the sun was rising pale and clean through the window, and Elias was already awake, standing by the door, looking out at the brightening sky. "Morning," she said, her voice rough with sleep. He turned, and for the first time since she'd found him, he almost smiled. "Morning." Clara sat up and ran a hand through her hair. "I'll head into town after breakfast. Should be back by afternoon. You sure about this?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." He nodded, and that almost smile faded into something more serious. "Be careful. Always am." But as Clara pulled on her boots and gathered her coat, she felt the weight of those words settle over her like a warning. Because careful wasn't always enough, not out here, not when the world was full of storms and strangers and secrets that had a way of surfacing when you least expected them. She glanced back at Elias one more time before stepping out into the morning light, and she couldn't shake the feeling that when she came back, everything would be different. The general store smelled of tobacco and old leather, the air thick with dust that hung in the shafts of light slanting through the windows. Clara stood at the counter while Mr. Brennan, the proprietor, tallied her supplies: flour, salt, coffee, a few tins of beans. His hands moved slow and deliberate, his fingers ink-stained and crooked with age. "Heard you took someone in," he said without looking up. Clara's spine stiffened. "News travels fast, always does." Brennan glanced at her over the rim of his spectacles. "Tommy Farrell saw smoke from your chimney at odd hours. Said you had washing on the line that looked too big to be yours." Clara kept her face neutral. "I have a guest. That a crime? Depends on the guest. He's a traveler. Got caught in the storm." Brennan hummed, non-committal, and went back to his ledger. "Storm's been over 3 days now. He lost his horse. I'm looking to buy another, if anyone's selling." The old man's pencil stopped moving. He looked at her fully now, his expression somewhere between concern and suspicion. "You sure that's wise, Clara? Buying a horse for a stranger?" "I didn't ask for your opinion, Mr. Brennan. I asked if anyone's selling." A long silence stretched between them. Then Brennan sighed and set down his pencil. "Old Hutchins has a gelding he might part with. Not much to look at, but sound enough. You'll find him at the livery." "Thank you." Clara paid for her supplies and carried them out to where her mare stood tethered in the shade. She loaded the saddlebag slowly, her hands steady, but her mind was racing. 3 days. Elias had been with her nearly a week now, and already the town was talking. She should have expected it, should have known that in a place this small, where lives were measured in whispers and glances, nothing stayed private for long. She mounted and turned the mare toward the livery, but before she'd gone more than a few steps, a voice called out behind her. "Clara Wynne!" She pulled the mare to a stop and turned. Marshal Danner stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his hat pulled low against the sun. He was a lean man, weathered and sharp-eyed, with the kind of stillness that made people uneasy. "Marshal," Clara said evenly. He stepped down into the street and walked toward her, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. When he reached her, he looked up with an expression that was hard to read. Not unkind, but not friendly either. "Heard you've got company out at your place," he said. "I do. Man or woman?" "Man. He got a name?" Clara hesitated, just for a heartbeat. "Elias. Elias what? Didn't ask." Danner's eyes narrowed. "You didn't ask. Didn't seem important." The marshal studied her for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing over words he didn't want to say. Then he sighed and looked off toward the hills, toward the direction of her cabin. "Clara, I'm not trying to make your life harder," he said quietly. "But we've had reports of a man wanted out of Carson Ridge. Armed robbery, maybe worse. Last seen heading this way before the storm hit." Clara's stomach turned to stone, but she kept her face calm. "And you think that's him?" "I don't know, but I'd be a fool not to check." "He's not dangerous." "You sure about that?" "I'm sure he was half dead when I found him. I'm sure he's done nothing but help me around the place since. And I'm sure that if he was running from something, he'd be long gone by now." Danner looked back at her, and something in his expression softened. "I hope you're right, but hope's not evidence, and evidence is what I deal in. I'll be riding out to your place in the next day or two, just to talk." "That all right with you?" It wasn't a question, not really. Clara nodded stiffly. "It's your job, Marshal." "It is." He stepped back and tipped his hat. "You be careful, Clara." She didn't answer. She turned the mare and rode toward the livery, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. The gelding was a dappled gray 15 hands high, with a white blaze down his face, and eyes that looked tired but steady. Hutchins wanted $30 for him, which was more than Clara had wanted to spend, but less than she'd feared. She counted out the bills slowly, feeling the weight of what she was doing settle over her like a coat she couldn't take off. "He treat you right?" Hutchins asked as he handed over the lead rope. "I hope so," Clara said. She rode back toward the cabin with the gelding trailing behind, the sun high and hot overhead, the land stretching out in all directions, golden and endless and lonelier than it had felt in weeks. Her mind kept circling back to Danner's words, to the way he'd looked at her when she'd defended Elias, like she was a fool. Or worse, like she was complicit. Maybe she was. She didn't know anymore. By the time she reached the cabin, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Elias was outside, splitting wood near the barn, his shirt damp with sweat, his movements rhythmic and sure. He looked up when he heard the horses, and when he saw the gelding, his expression went carefully blank. Clara dismounted and led both horses toward him. Hutchins said he's sound. Not fast, but he'll get you where you need to go. Elias set down the axe and walked over slowly, his eyes on the horse. He ran a hand down the gelding's neck, checking his legs, his teeth, his hooves, the practiced movements of someone who knew horses well. When he was done, he straightened and looked at Clara. "How much?" he asked quietly. "Doesn't matter, Clara." "It doesn't matter," she said again, sharper than she meant to. She took a breath and softened her tone. "You can pay me back when you're able, or not. Either way, he's yours now." Elias looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something raw and unguarded in his face. Gratitude, yes, but also shame, and something deeper that might have been grief. Then he looked away, his jaw tight, and nodded once. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rough enough that she knew he meant it. Clara handed him the lead rope. "Marshall's coming by in a day or two, wants to talk." Elias went very still. "About what?" "There's a man wanted out of Carson Ridge. Robbery. Maybe murder. Danner thinks it might be you." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Elias stared at the ground, his hand tight around the rope, his breathing slow and controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, almost empty. "It's not me. I know." He looked up sharply. "You don't know that. Then tell me I'm wrong." Their eyes met, and for a moment Clara saw the truth there, not in words, but in the way he held himself, in the exhaustion and the fear and the anger that he kept locked down tight. Whatever he'd done, whatever he was running from, it wasn't what Danner thought. She believed that. She had to. "I'm not a murderer," Elias said quietly. "I didn't think you were, but you're not sure." Clara crossed her arms. "I'm sure enough to buy you a horse. That'll have to be good enough for now." He nodded slowly, and some of the tension drained out of his shoulders. "What do you want me to do when the marshal comes? Tell him the truth, whatever that is, and if he doesn't believe me, then we'll deal with it." Elias looked at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't understand. "Why are you helping me?" Clara didn't have an answer for that. Not one that made sense anyway, so she turned and started walking back toward the cabin, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Because someone should," she said over her shoulder, and she left him standing there with the horse, the axe, and the truth he still hadn't told. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal, almost peaceful. The sun rose and warmed the valley, and the land began to dry out, the mud hardening back into dust, the creeks running clear and cold with the last of the runoff. Elias worked from dawn until dusk, mending fences, clearing brush, fixing the loose shingles on the barn roof that Clara had been meaning to get to for months. He didn't complain, didn't ask for anything, just moved through the tasks with a quiet determination that reminded Clara of the way Daniel used to work. But Elias wasn't Daniel. And the quiet between them wasn't the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other well. It was something else, something more fragile, built on questions neither of them wanted to ask and answers neither of them wanted to give. Still, there were moments. One evening, as the sun turned the western sky to fire, Elias showed Clara how to shoot properly. He'd noticed the old rifle she kept above the door, noticed the way she handled it, too loose, too uncertain, and he'd offered to teach her. They walked out beyond the barn to where the land opened up, and he set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log. "Stand like this," he said, positioning himself beside her, feet shoulder-width apart. "Weight forward, not back." Clara adjusted her stance and he moved behind her, his hands guiding hers, one on the stock, one on the barrel. His touch was careful, impersonal, but she felt the heat of him anyway, the solid presence of another person in her space. "Breathe in," he said quietly, his voice close to her ear. "Let half of it out. Hold, then squeeze. Don't pull." She did as he said, and the rifle kicked against her shoulder, the shot ringing out across the valley. The can flew backward off the log, and Clara laughed, a sound that surprised her, bright and unguarded. "Again," Elias said, and she heard the almost smile in his voice. They stayed out there until the light failed, and by the end Clara could hit 4 out of 5. Elias nodded his approval as they walked back toward the cabin, the rifle slung over her shoulder, the evening air cool against her flushed skin. "You're a quick study," he said. "Had a good teacher." He glanced at her, and for just a moment something softened in his expression. "Daniel teach you anything?" Clara's steps faltered. She hadn't expected him to know the name, hadn't realized she'd said it aloud. But she must have, at some point. In sleep maybe, or in some unguarded moment she couldn't remember. "Some," she said quietly. "Not enough." Elias didn't push. He just nodded and kept walking, and Clara was grateful for that, for the way he seemed to understand, that some things were too tender to touch. Another day, she taught him how to plant. The earth was finally soft enough, the rains having done what months of drought couldn't, and Clara decided it was time to put in a late garden. Elias watched as she showed him how to dig the furrows, how to space the seeds, how to cover them gently so they wouldn't wash away. "Seems like a lot of hope to put in a handful of dirt," he said. Clara smiled. "That's all farming is. Hope and dirt." They worked side by side, their hands dark with soil, the sun warm on their backs. It was simple work, repetitive and grounding, and Clara found herself relaxing into it, into the rhythm of it, into the companionship of it. Elias didn't talk much, but she noticed the way his shoulders had loosened over the past few days, the way the tension in his jaw had eased. He looked less like a man on the run, and more like a man trying to remember what it felt like to stay. That evening, after supper, Elias sat at the table with a piece of wood and a small knife, carving something Clara couldn't quite see. She washed the dishes and watched him from the corner of her eye, curious but not wanting to intrude. His hands moved with careful precision, shaving away thin curls of wood that fell like snow onto the table. When he was done, he held it up, a small wooden token, no bigger than a silver dollar, with her mare's name carved into it in neat, simple letters, Sable. He set it on the table and pushed it toward her. For what she did, he said quietly. "Carrying me when she didn't have to." Clara picked it up, running her thumb over the smooth surface, the carved letters. It was rough made, humble, but there was care in it, real care, the kind that came from gratitude and something deeper. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Elias looked away, his jaw tight, and she knew the words had cost him something. So she slipped the token into her pocket and didn't say anything more. But that night, lying in her bed with the fire burning low, Clara took it out and held it in the darkness, feeling the weight of it, light as a whisper, heavy as a promise. And for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel alone. On the 6th morning, Clara woke to the sound of hoofbeats. She was up and at the window before she was fully awake, her heart hammering, her breath caught in her chest. Outside, a single rider was coming up the valley, slow and steady, the sun at his back. Marshal Danner. Clara crossed to the cot, but Elias was already awake, already sitting up, his eyes on the window. He'd heard it too. "It's him," Clara said. Elias stood and pulled on his boots, his face unreadable. "What do you want me to do?" "Just be yourself. Tell the truth." He looked at her, and she saw the fear there. Not of Danner exactly, but of what the truth might cost. Then he nodded and walked to the door, stepping out onto the porch just as the marshal dismounted. Clara followed, her arms crossed, her stance protective without meaning to be. "Morning, Clara," Danner said, tipping his hat. Then he turned to Elias. "And you must be the guest." "Elias Rowe," Elias said evenly. Danner studied him for a long moment, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Mind if I ask you a few questions, Mr. Rowe?" "Go ahead." "Where you from?" "North of here." "Was heading to the rail line when the storm hit. You a wanted man?" Elias didn't flinch. "Not that I know of." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Danner's jaw tightened. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, a wanted poster, worn and creased. He unfolded it and held it up. Clara's blood ran cold. The face on the poster wasn't an exact match. The drawing was rough, the features vague, but it was close enough that anyone looking might see a resemblance, close enough to plant doubt. "This you?" Danner asked. Elias stared at the poster, his face like stone. "No." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Danner folded the poster and tucked it back into his coat. "Man on this poster robbed a bank in Carson Ridge, shot a clerk, left him for dead. That wasn't me. Can you prove it?" Elias's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice stayed level. "I was on the trail when that happened. Alone, no witnesses. Convenient. It's the truth." Danner looked at Clara. "You believe him?" Clara met his eyes without wavering. "I do. Based on what?" based on the fact that he's had a week to rob me, hurt me, or run, and he's done none of those things. Based on the fact that he's worked harder than any man I've seen in years. Based on the fact that I'm a better judge of character than you're giving me credit for." The marshal sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Clara, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying you might not have all the facts. Then get them. But don't come onto my land and accuse a man without proof." Danner looked between them. Clara, defiant and steady. Elias, silent and tense. And something shifted in his expression. Not belief exactly, but maybe the beginning of doubt. Or at least the willingness to walk away without pushing further. "All right," he said finally. "I'll make some inquiries. Send a wire to Carson Ridge, see what I can find out. But Mr. Rowe, I'd advise you not to leave town until this is settled." "I'm not planning to," Elias said quietly. Danner nodded and turned back to his horse. He mounted slowly, his movements deliberate, and looked down at Clara one last time. "I hope you're right about him," he said. "So do I," Clara replied. And then he rode away, the dust rising behind him, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the morning stillness. Clara and Elias stood on the porch, neither of them speaking, until the marshal was out of sight. Then Elias let out a long, shaky breath and sat down hard on the steps, his head in his hands. "I should go," he said, "before this gets worse." Clara sat down beside him. "You're not going anywhere." "Clara, you're not," she said firmly. "Not until we know the truth. Not until Danner knows the truth." Elias looked at her, and his eyes were raw with something that might have been hope or despair or both. "Why do you care?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked out at the valley, at the land that had been hers and Daniel's, at the quiet life she'd built from grief and stubbornness. And she realized that somewhere in the past week, that life had started to change. Had started to feel less like survival, and more like something worth living. "Because you're here," she said quietly. "And that means something." Elias held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and uncertain, and looked away. And as the sun climbed higher, warming the valley, Clara sat beside him in the silence and hoped, truly hoped, that she wasn't wrong. The telegram came on a Tuesday morning, carried by a boy no older than 12 who rode his pony hard up the valley road, dust billowing behind him like smoke. Clara was hanging laundry on the line when she heard the hoofbeats, and something in the urgency of them made her hands go still on the wet sheet. Elias was in the barn, shoeing the gelding. She heard him step out, heard the measured cadence of his boots on the packed earth as he came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke as the boy pulled his pony to a halt and held out a folded piece of paper, his young face serious with the importance of his task. "For you, Mrs. Wynne," he said, slightly breathless. "Marshall said to bring it quick." Clara took the telegram with fingers that had gone cold despite the warmth of the sun. She pressed a coin into the boy's palm, and he tipped his hat and rode off, leaving her standing there with Elias at her shoulder and a piece of paper that felt heavier than it should. She unfolded it slowly. The words were brief, typed in stark capital letters that gave them the weight of judgment. Elias Rose stop wanted, Carson Ridge stop armed robbery, April 12 stop murder charge, pending stop witness testimony positive ID, stop reward $500 stop advised detain stop Danner. Clara read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something different, something that didn't turn her stomach to ice. When she looked up, Elias was watching her face, and she saw in his eyes that he already knew. "What does it say?" he asked quietly. She handed it to him without a word. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening with each line, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. When he was done, he folded it carefully and gave it back to her. His movements precise, controlled, the kind of control that comes from holding everything else inside. "It wasn't how they say it," he said, his voice rough. "I need you to know that. Then tell me how it was." Elias turned away, his hands curling into fists at his sides. For a long moment he stood there, staring out at the horizon, and Clara waited, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "I was with a crew," he said finally. 5 of us. We were moving cattle north, seasonal work, good money. The foreman, his name was Jack Henley, he got it in his head that we could make more in one night than we'd see all season. Said there was a bank in Carson Ridge that was easy pickings. Said the law there was old and slow, and we'd be gone before anyone knew what happened. He paused, his shoulders rising and falling with a breath that looked like it hurt. I told him no. Told him I wasn't interested in that kind of trouble. But the others, they were young, stupid, desperate. They listened to Jack, and when the night came they rode out without me. Clara stepped closer, her voice low. Then how are you wanted? Because Jack used my name when he signed the crew ledger at the boarding house. Because the clerk who got shot, he lived long enough to give a description, and it matched me close enough. Because when the posse came looking, the others scattered, and I was the only one they could find. Where were you when it happened? At the boarding house, asleep. But no one believed me, no one wanted to. They had a name, they had a face, and that was enough. Clara's hands tightened on the telegram. So you ran? I ran, Elias admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I knew how it would go. I'd seen men hang for less. I'd seen justice get traded for convenience. So I took my horse, and I ran, and I kept running until the storm hit and my horse died and you found me. He turned to face her then, and his eyes were filled with something raw and desperate. I didn't kill anyone, Clara. I didn't rob that bank. But I can't prove it, and no one's going to believe me. Clara stared at him, the telegram crumpling in her fist. Every instinct she had told her he was telling the truth. The way he spoke, the way he held himself, the way he'd been these past weeks. But instinct wasn't evidence, and evidence was what the law would want. What do we do? She asked. We? Elias shook his head. There's no we, Clara. This is my trouble, not yours. I need to leave before Danner comes back. And go where? You think you can outrun this? You think they won't find you eventually? Maybe, maybe not, but at least you won't be caught in the middle. Clara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I'm already in the middle. I've been in the middle since the moment I gave you water. So don't tell me this isn't my trouble. Clara, we find the truth, she said firmly. We find the men who did this, or we find proof that you weren't there. We find something, but you don't run. Not yet. Elias looked at her like she'd lost her mind. You're asking me to trust that the law will listen, that they'll care about the truth more than they care about closing a case. I'm asking you to trust me. The silence that followed was long and heavy, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk and the rustle of wind through the dry grass. Elias's throat worked, and she saw the war happening behind his eyes, between fear and hope, between running and staying, between the man he'd been forced to become and the man he might still be. All right, he said finally, his voice hoarse. All right, Clara nodded, though her hands were shaking. I'm riding into town. I'm going to talk to Danner, see if there's anything else in that wire, anything we can use. You stay here, don't go anywhere, don't do anything stupid. And if he comes to arrest me, then we deal with it. She started toward the barn to saddle Sable, but Elias caught her arm, his grip gentle but firm. Why are you doing this? He asked, and there was something broken in his voice. Why are you risking everything for me? Clara looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face, at the exhaustion and the fear, and the desperate need to believe that someone, somewhere, still saw him as more than what the world had labeled him. Because I know what it's like, she said quietly, to be judged for things you can't control, to have people look at you and see only what you've lost, not what you still are. And I know what it's like to need someone to believe you when no one else will. She pulled free gently and walked to the barn, leaving Elias standing in the yard with the morning sun burning down on him, and the weight of borrowed hope heavy on his shoulders. The town was different this time. Clara felt it the moment she rode in, the way conversations stopped when she passed, the way eyes followed her down the street, the way people who'd known her for years suddenly found reasons to look away. Word had spread, of course it had. The telegraph operator would have read the wire, the boy who delivered it would have told his mother, and his mother would have told everyone. By now, the whole town knew she was harboring a wanted man. Clara tied Sable outside the marshal's office and took a steadying breath before stepping inside. Danner was at his desk, a cup of coffee in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. He looked up when she entered, and his expression was weary, almost sympathetic. I figured you'd come, he said. I need to see the full report, Clara said without preamble. Everything that came through on that wire. Danner set down his coffee and leaned back in his chair. Clara, you need to understand something. This isn't a misunderstanding. This isn't a case of mistaken identity. There are witnesses. There's testimony. The bank clerk identified Elias Rowe by name. The bank clerk was dying. People make mistakes when they're dying. 3 other people put him at the scene. Who? The gang he rode with? The men who actually did it? Danner's jaw tightened. I don't have all the details yet, but I have enough to know that when I ride out to your place tomorrow, I'm bringing him in. And Clara, if you try to stop me, I'll have to bring you in too. Harboring a fugitive is a crime. Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. He wasn't there, Marshall. He didn't do this. How do you know? Because I know him. You've known him 2 weeks. I've known men all my life. I know the difference between someone who's dangerous and someone who's desperate. Elias is desperate. He's scared, but he's not a killer. Danner stood and walked around the desk to face her. Clara, I respect you. I respected Daniel, and I respect what you've built out there on your own. But you're letting your heart make decisions your head should be making. This man could be lying to you. He could be using you. And if you keep protecting him, you're going to lose everything. And if I don't protect him, an innocent man hangs. You don't know that he's innocent, and you don't know that he's guilty. They stared at each other, the air between them thick with tension. Then Danner sighed and rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking older than his years. I'm coming tomorrow at noon, he said quietly. I'm sorry, Clara. But this is the law. Clara turned and walked out without another word, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She stood on the boardwalk and looked down the street at the faces that still watched her, some curious, some pitying, some openly hostile. She saw Mrs. Pritchard whispering to her daughter. She saw old Tom Farrell shaking his head. She saw the blacksmith spit into the dirt and turn his back. This was the price of mercy, she realized. This was what it cost to stand beside someone the world had already condemned. She untied Sable and mounted, turning the mare toward home. But before she'd gone more than a few yards, a voice called out behind her. Mrs. Wynne! Clara pulled up and turned. A woman stood on the boardwalk, young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a bun, and eyes that were red-rimmed from crying. Clara didn't recognize her. Yes? The woman stepped into the street, wringing her hands. I'm Sarah Henley. My husband was Jack Henley. He was the one who led the robbery. Clara's breath caught. He's dead. Died 3 weeks ago. Bullet wound got infected. Sarah's voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Before he died, he told me the truth. About Carson Ridge, about how he used another man's name, about how he left that man to take the blame. Clara dismounted and moved closer, her heart hammering. He told you it was Elias Rowe? Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. He said he was sorry, said he never meant for it to go that far, but he died before I could get him to tell the law. And I didn't know what to do. I was scared they'd come after me, after our kids. So I stayed quiet. Why are you telling me now? Sarah looked up, her eyes desperate and pleading. Because I heard what they're saying about you, about how you're protecting, and I couldn't. I couldn't let an innocent man hang because I was too scared to speak up. I can't live with that. Clara's throat tightened. Will you tell the marshal? I will. I'll tell him everything Jack told me. But I don't know if it'll be enough. I don't have proof. It's just my word. Your word is more than we had an hour ago. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. I'm sorry. For what my husband did. For what it's cost you. Clara reached out and squeezed the woman's hand. Thank you. For being brave enough to come forward. She rode home faster than she should have, her mind spinning with this new information. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall, a glimmer of light in the dark. And if they could widen that crack, if they could find just one more piece of evidence. But when Clara crested the ridge and saw the cabin below, her hope turned to ash in her mouth. There were horses in the yard, 5 of them, and standing on her porch surrounded by men with rifles was Elias, his hands raised, his face pale, his eyes searching the ridge until they found her. Clara kicked Sable into a gallop and flew down the hillside, her heart in her throat. She pulled up hard in the yard, dust swirling around her, and was off the horse before it had fully stopped. What's going on? She demanded. Marshal Danner stepped forward, his expression grim. I'm sorry, Clara, but I got word from Carson Ridge that Elias Rowe is wanted for questioning in another matter. I can't wait until tomorrow. Another matter? What matter? That's between him and the law and Carson Ridge. Clara looked at Elias and he shook his head slightly. A warning, or maybe a plea. She turned back to Danner, her voice shaking with fury. "You can't do this. You don't have all the facts. I have a warrant. That's all I need. I have a witness. Sarah Henley. She'll testify that her husband confessed to the robbery, that Elias wasn't there." Danner paused, and she saw doubt flicker across his face. "Sarah Henley? Jack Henley's widow. She's in town right now. Talk to her, please, before you do this." The marshal looked between Clara and Elias, his jaw working. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, I'll talk to her. But Elias still needs to come with me. If her testimony clears him, we'll sort it out. But until then, he's in custody." "Marshal." "That's the best I can do, Clara." One of the deputies stepped forward with iron shackles, and Clara watched, helpless, as they locked them around Elias's wrists. The sound of the metal clicking shut was like a door slamming, final and cold. Elias looked at her one last time as they led him toward the horses, and she saw everything he couldn't say. Gratitude and sorrow and fear and something that might have been goodbye. "I'll fix this," Clara called after him, her voice breaking. "I promise, I'll fix this." But he didn't answer. They lifted him onto a horse and tied his hands to the saddle horn, and then they were riding away, taking him toward town, toward a cell, toward a noose if she couldn't stop it. Clara stood in the yard long after they'd disappeared, her hands shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sun was high and merciless, and the silence was so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. Then she turned and ran into the cabin. She grabbed the wooden token Elias had carved, Sable, and clutched it so hard the edges bit into her palm. She thought of the way he'd looked at her that first morning, half dead and desperate, the way he'd worked beside her in the rain, the way he'd taught her to shoot, his voice quiet and patient, the way he'd carved this token, his hands careful, his heart offered in the only way he knew how. And she thought of Daniel, cold in the ground, and the 2 years she'd spent alone, convincing herself that solitude was safety. But it wasn't. Solitude was just another kind of dying. Clara wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. She tucked the token into her pocket and walked back outside. The sun was still burning, the land still harsh and unforgiving. But somewhere in that harshness, there was truth. And she was going to find it, even if it cost her everything. That night, Clara sat alone at the table, a lamp burning low, and wrote down everything Elias had told her, every detail, every name, every moment. She wrote until her hand cramped, and the lamp began to gutter, and then she folded the papers carefully and tucked them into her saddlebag. Tomorrow, she would ride to Carson Ridge. Tomorrow, she would find the truth, and she would bring Elias home, or die trying. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, and the stars burned cold and distant. And somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out. Lonely and defiant and utterly alone, Clara left before dawn, the sky still black and studded with stars that looked like ice. She'd packed light, a bedroll, a canteen, dried meat, the papers she'd written, and the wooden token that never left her pocket now. Sable stood patient in the cold while Clara saddled her, the mare's breath rising in pale clouds that disappeared into the darkness. The ride to Carson Ridge would take 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turned. 3 days there, however long it took to find what she needed, then 3 days back, a week, maybe more. And Elias would be sitting in a cell the entire time, waiting for a trial that might come before she returned. She tried not to think about that. Clara swung into the saddle and turned Sable toward the east, toward the place where the sky was just beginning to pale at its edges. The land stretched out before her, vast and indifferent, and she felt the weight of what she was doing settle over her like a shroud. She was one woman on a tired horse, riding into a town where she knew no one, looking for proof that might not exist, trying to save a man the world had already decided was guilty. It was madness, but it was the only choice she had left. The first day passed in a blur of dust and heat, and the rhythmic sound of Sable's hooves on the hardpan. Clara followed the old cattle trail that wound through the canyons, past dry creek beds and stands of juniper that clung to the rocky soil like stubborn prayers. She saw no one. The land was empty, scoured clean by drought and abandonment, and the silence was so complete it felt like she was riding through the bones of the world. By the time the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of copper and blood, Clara's body ached and her mind was numb with exhaustion. She made camp in a shallow draw where a few scraggly mesquites offered some shelter from the wind. She unsaddled Sable and rubbed her down, then picketed her where she could reach what little grass remained. Clara built a small fire and sat beside it, chewing slowly on a piece of dried meat that tasted like leather and dust. She stared into the flames and thought about Elias, about the way he'd looked when they'd put the shackles on him, the way his eyes had found hers across the yard. She thought about the things he'd told her, the pieces of his story that she'd written down by lamplight, and she thought about the woman in town, Sarah Henley, who'd been brave enough to speak even when it terrified her. One voice against the narrative the law had already constructed. One widow's testimony against the weight of warrants and witnesses, and a system that preferred easy answers to true ones. It wasn't enough. Clara knew that. But it was a beginning. She pulled the wooden token from her pocket and turned it over in her hands, her thumb tracing the carved letters of Sable's name. In the firelight, the wood looked warm, alive, and she remembered the concentration on Elias's face as he'd worked on it, the careful way his hands had moved. A man who carved tokens of gratitude wasn't a murderer. A man who mended fences and planted seeds and taught a widow how to shoot straight wasn't a killer. But the law didn't care about tokens and fences and quiet moments of grace. The law cared about evidence and witnesses and the stories people told when they were trying to save their own skins. Clara closed her fist around the token and stared up at the stars. They looked the same here as they did above her cabin, cold and distant and unmoved by human suffering. She wondered if Elias could see them from his cell. She wondered if he was thinking about her, about what she was trying to do. She wondered if he believed she'd come back. The fire burned down to embers, and Clara lay down on her bedroll, pulling her coat tight against the chill. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of wind, and the shifting of Sable's hooves, and the weight of doubt that pressed against her chest like a stone. The second day was harder. The trail grew rougher, winding through broken country, where the rocks rose up like the vertebrae of some long-dead beast. Clara's water was running low, and she'd seen no sign of a creek or spring since morning. Sable's gait had slowed, her head hanging lower, and Clara knew she was pushing the mare too hard. But there was no choice. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to a trial, a verdict, a rope. By midday the sun was a white hole in the sky, and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Clara's lips were cracked, her throat raw, and when she reached for her canteen, she found it nearly empty. She gave Sable the last of the water, pouring it into her cupped hand and letting the mare drink, her velvet muzzle soft and desperate against Clara's palm. "I know, girl," Clara murmured. "I know. Just a little farther." She remounted and pressed on, her eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of water, any hint of green that might mean a spring. The land gave her nothing. Just rock and dust and the skeletal remains of cattle that hadn't survived the drought. It was late afternoon when she finally saw it, a dark line of trees in a fold of the hills, the kind of growth that only happened near water. Clara urged Sable forward, and the mare responded with a burst of energy born from instinct and need. They reached the trees and found a small spring bubbling up from between the rocks, clear and cold, a miracle in the wasteland. Clara dismounted and let Sable drink first, then knelt beside the spring and cupped water to her own mouth. It was sweet and clean, and she felt it run down her throat like salvation. She filled her canteen, then sat back against a boulder and closed her eyes, letting the shade and the sound of the water ease the tension in her shoulders. She stayed there longer than she should have, resting in the coolness, letting Sable graze on the thin grass that grew near the spring. When she finally stood to leave, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, and she knew she'd have to make camp soon. But as she turned to gather Sable's reins, she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Clara's hand went to the rifle in her saddle scabbard, her heart suddenly pounding. She pulled the rifle free and levered around into the chamber, then stepped behind a boulder and waited. 2 riders came into view, men, rough-looking, with the kind of lean hunger that came from hard living. They saw Sable first, then Clara, and they pulled up short, their hands moving toward their gun belts. "Easy," Clara said, keeping the rifle trained on them. "I don't want trouble." The first man, older and grizzled with a scar running down his left cheek, raised his hands slowly. "Neither do we, ma'am. Just saw the spring and thought we'd water our horses. Go ahead. But keep your hands where I can see them." The men dismounted carefully and led their horses to the spring. Clara watched them, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, every nerve in her body alert. They drank and filled their canteens, and the whole time the younger one kept glancing at her. Not threatening exactly, but appraising, like he was trying to figure out what a woman was doing alone in the middle of nowhere. "You headed to Carson Ridge?" the older man asked as he capped his canteen. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "I am. Long ride for a woman alone. I can manage." The man studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm sure you can. Just be careful when you get there. Town's been stirred up lately. Bank robbery a few weeks back. Law's been cracking down hard on anyone who looks like they might be trouble." Clara's pulse quickened. "You know anything about that robbery?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Why do you ask?" "Because the man they arrested for it is innocent, and I'm trying to prove it." The two men exchanged a glance. Then the younger one spoke up, his voice cautious. "The man they arrested was named Elias Rowe?" "That's right." The younger man shook his head. "Wasn't him. I was in Carson Ridge when it happened. Saw the whole thing. 5 men rode in hard, hit the bank, shot the clerk, and rode out. Elias Rowe wasn't one of them." Clara lowered the rifle slightly, hope surging in her chest. "You're sure?" "Positive. I knew Rowe, worked cattle with him the season before. Good man. Kept to himself, did his job, never caused trouble. When I heard they were saying he did it, I knew it was wrong." "Then why didn't you tell the law?" The young man's face darkened. "Because the law didn't want to hear it. They had their man, they had their story, and anyone who said different got told to shut up or get out. So I got out." Clara's hands tightened on the rifle. "Will you testify? Will you tell them what you told me?" The young man looked at his companion, then back at Clara, his expression pained. "Ma'am, I want to help. But if I go back there and start contradicting the law, I'll end up in a cell myself, or worse. I got a family to think about, and Elias has no one. Except me." The silence that followed was heavy. The older man sighed and spat into the dust. "The man you need to talk to is Preacher Samuels. He runs a small church on the south edge of town. He was the one who buried Jack Henley, the real leader of the gang. Henley confessed to him before he died. Made a full confession, names and everything. The preacher's been trying to get the law to listen, but they won't. Why not? Because it's easier to hang one man than to admit they got it wrong and have to start over. And because the bank wants someone to pay, and they don't much care who it is." Clara's jaw tightened. "Where can I find this preacher?" "Little white church at the end of Main Street. Can't miss it. But be careful, ma'am. There's folks in Carson Ridge who won't take kindly to you stirring things up. I don't care what they take kindly to." The older man smiled faintly. "No, I don't suppose you do. Good luck, ma'am. I hope you find what you're looking for." The two men mounted their horses and rode off, heading west, back the way Clara had come. She watched them go, then looked down at the rifle in her hands, at the spring bubbling quietly at her feet, at the long shadows stretching across the rocks. A preacher who knew the truth, a confession given to God and witnessed by a man of faith. It still might not be enough, but it was more than she'd had yesterday. Clara saddled Sable and rode on as the sun bled out of the sky and the stars began to appear, cold and bright and impossibly far away. She made camp in a dry wash and lay awake most of the night, staring up at those stars and thinking about what she'd say to Preacher Samuels, about how she'd convince him to help, about what she'd do if he refused. She thought about Elias, alone in his cell, counting the hours. And she thought about the wooden token in her pocket, about the way Elias's hands had moved when he carved it, about the gratitude and hope and fragile trust that had passed between them in those quiet days before the world came crashing in. She wouldn't let him hang. She couldn't. Carson Ridge appeared on the horizon late on the third day, a collection of weathered buildings huddled in the shadow of red rock cliffs, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into the pale sky. Clara rode in slowly, her body aching from days in the saddle, her eyes scanning the streets for the white church the men had told her about. The town was bigger than she'd expected, and busier. Men moved along the boardwalks. Horses stood tethered outside the saloon and the general store, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed from somewhere near the edge of town where new construction was underway. No one paid her much attention, just another traveler passing through, dusty and worn. She found the church at the south end of Main Street, exactly where the men had said it would be. It was small and plain, with a cross mounted above the door and windows that glowed softly in the fading light. Clara dismounted and tied Sable to the hitching post, then stood for a moment, gathering her courage. This was it. This was the moment that would determine everything. She climbed the steps and knocked on the door. For a long moment there was no answer. Then the door opened, and a man stood in the threshold, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a face lined with the kind of weariness that came from carrying other people's burdens. He wore a simple black suit and a white collar, and when he saw Clara, he smiled gently. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Are you Preacher Samuels?" "I am." Clara took a breath. "My name is Clara Wynne. I've ridden 3 days from the valley to talk to you about Elias Rowe." The preacher's smile faded, and something heavy settled over his features. He glanced past her, down the street, then stepped back and gestured inside. "Come in," he said quietly. "We need to talk." Clara followed him into the church, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a confession sealed. The interior was simple: wooden pews, a plain altar, a few candles burning in the dim light. The preacher led her to the front pew and sat down beside her, his hands folded in his lap, his expression grave. "You're here about Jack Henley's confession," he said. "I am." "Then you know what he told me." "I know he said Elias Rowe wasn't part of the robbery, that he used Elias's name to cover his own tracks." Preacher Samuels nodded slowly. "He did. Jack came to me 3 days before he died. He was in terrible pain, and he knew he didn't have long. He wanted to make peace with God, and he wanted to clear his conscience. He told me everything: the robbery, the shooting, the men who rode with him. 5 men, and Elias Rowe wasn't one of them." "Then why haven't you told the law?" The preacher's face darkened. "I tried. I went to the marshal the day after Jack died. I told him everything. He said it didn't matter. Said a dying man's confession wasn't enough to overturn a positive identification. Said Elias Rowe had been tied to the scene by multiple witnesses, and unless I had hard evidence to prove otherwise, the case was closed." Clara's hands curled into fists. "So you just gave up?" "No," the preacher said firmly. "I've been writing letters to the territorial judge, to the governor's office, to anyone who might listen. But these things take time, and I'm just one voice. I can't make them act faster. Elias doesn't have time. They're going to try him, and if I can't bring back proof that he's innocent, they're going to hang him." Preacher Samuels looked at her with eyes full of sorrow and understanding. "You care for him." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "I do. He's a good man. And he doesn't deserve this." The preacher was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to a small desk at the side of the church. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased. He brought it back to Clara and placed it in her hands. "This is Jack Henley's confession," he said, written in his own hand, signed and dated. "He gave it to me the night before he died and asked me to give it to the law. I made a copy and sent the original to the territorial judge. This is the copy. Take it. Use it however you can." Clara unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The handwriting was rough and uneven, the words misspelled in places, but the meaning was clear. "I, Jack Henley, do confess to the robbery of the bank in Carson Ridge on April 12th. It was me and 4 others. We shot the clerk. Elias Rowe had nothing to do with it. I used his name because I was a coward. I am sorry for what I done. May God forgive me." Below the words was a shaky signature and a date. Clara's eyes blurred with tears. "This is it. This is what we need." "I hope it's enough," the preacher said quietly. "But you need to understand something, Mrs. Wynne. The people in power don't always care about the truth. They care about order, about closing cases, about not looking like fools. This confession might help, but it might not be enough to stop what's already been set in motion. Then what do? You fight. You bring this to the judge, to anyone who will listen. You make enough noise that they can't ignore you, and you pray that there's still enough justice left in this world to matter." Clara folded the confession carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket, right next to the wooden token. "Thank you, preacher, for not giving up, for doing what's right even when no one wanted to listen. That's my calling, Mrs. Wynne. I only wish I could do more." Clara stood and shook his hand. Then she walked out of the church and into the gathering darkness, her heart pounding with something that felt like hope, fragile and fierce. She had the confession. She had the truth. Now she just had to get it home before it was too late. Clara didn't sleep that night. She rode through the darkness, pushing Sable harder than she should have, driven by the fear that every hour she wasted was an hour closer to Elias's trial. The mare was exhausted, stumbling occasionally on the rough ground, but she kept going, her loyalty deeper than any human promise. By dawn, they'd covered more ground than Clara had thought possible. But they were still days away from home, and her supplies were running low, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. She stopped at a small creek to let Sable drink and graze, and she sat on the bank with her head in her hands, exhaustion and fear and determination warring inside her. She pulled out Jack Henley's confession and read it again, memorizing every word, as if the act of reading would somehow make it more real, more powerful. Then she pulled out the wooden token and held it alongside the paper, 2 pieces of proof, one carved from wood and one written in ink, both testaments to the truth of who Elias Rowe really was, a man worth saving. Clara tucked both back into her pocket and stood, her legs trembling. She whistled for Sable, and the mare came to her, tired but willing. Clara pressed her forehead against Sable's neck and breathed in the smell of horse and dust and sweat. "One more push, girl," she whispered. "Just one more." She mounted and turned toward home, toward the valley, toward the man waiting in a cell for a miracle he probably didn't believe would come. And as the sun rose higher, burning away the last of the night's coolness, Clara rode on, through dust and heat and doubt, carrying the truth like a flame that refused to go out. Because mercy, once given, demanded to be honored, and she would honor it, no matter the cost. Clara rode into town on the 7th day, and the sun was already climbing toward noon, hot and unforgiving. Sable's flanks were lathered with sweat, her head hanging low, every step a testament to exhaustion and will. Clara's own body felt like it had been beaten. Her back ached, her hands were raw from the reins, and her eyes burned from days of dust and sleepless nights. But none of that mattered now, because the square was filling with people. She saw them from the ridge, a crowd gathering in front of the courthouse, spilling out into the street, their faces turned toward the scaffold that had been erected in the center of the square. The scaffold. Clara's heart seized in her chest, and she kicked Sable into a stumbling run, the mare finding some last reserve of strength she shouldn't have had. No, they couldn't have moved the trial up. She'd only been gone a week, but as she got closer, she saw the truth of it. The scaffold was finished, the rope already coiled and waiting, and being led from the jailhouse, his hands shackled, his face pale as death, was Elias. Clara didn't think. She just rode straight into the square, scattering people, Sable's hooves clattering on the hard-packed earth. She pulled up in front of the courthouse steps and half fell from the saddle, her legs barely holding her weight. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "Stop this!" Marshal Danner was there, along with Judge Holloway, a gray-haired man with a stern face and eyes like flint. The crowd turned to stare at her. Dozens of faces, some curious, some angry, some merely hungry for spectacle. Clara saw Mrs. Brennan clutching her shawl. She saw the blacksmith with his arms crossed. She saw young Tommy Farrell standing on a crate to see better, and she saw Elias standing at the base of the scaffold steps, his eyes finding hers across the crowd. The look on his face was complex, surprise and relief, and something that might have been despair, because he knew what it cost her to be here, what it would cost her to fight this battle in front of everyone. Danner stepped forward, his hand raised. "Clara, you need to step back. This is a legal proceeding. This is a lynching." Clara spat. She reached into her coat and pulled out the folded confession, holding it high. "And I have proof that Elias Rowe is innocent." A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "What kind of proof?" "A written confession from Jack Henley, the man who actually led the robbery, signed, dated, and given to Preacher Samuels before Henley died. It clears Elias completely." She pushed through the crowd and climbed the courthouse steps, thrusting the paper toward the judge. He took it slowly, unfolding it with deliberate care, his expression unreadable. The crowd fell silent, waiting, and Clara felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders. Judge Holloway read the confession once, then twice. His jaw tightened, and when he looked up, his eyes moved from Clara to Elias to Marshal Danner. "This is Jack Henley's handwriting?" he asked. "It is, Your Honor," came a voice from the crowd. Sarah Henley stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "That's my husband's hand. I'd know it anywhere. And what it says is true. Jack confessed to me before he died. Told me he'd used Elias Rowe's name because he was a coward. Told me Elias had nothing to do with the robbery." Another murmur, louder this time. Judge Holloway's expression remained stern, but Clara saw something shift behind his eyes. Doubt maybe, or the beginning of it. "And yet," The judge said slowly, "We have witness testimony that placed Elias Rowe at the scene. The bank clerk identified him by name before he died." "The bank clerk was dying and in shock," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He heard a name, Elias Rowe, and he repeated it, but Jack Henley used that name. The clerk never saw Elias. He couldn't have, because Elias was 60 miles away when the robbery happened." "Can you prove that?" "I can," said another voice, and Clara turned to see the two men from the spring pushing through the crowd, the older one with the scar, and the younger one who'd worked with Elias. The younger man climbed the steps and stood beside Clara, his face set with determination. "My name's Tom Carver," he said. "I worked cattle with Elias Rowe the season before the robbery. I was in Carson Ridge the day it happened, and I saw the whole thing. 5 men rode in and hit that bank, and Elias Rowe wasn't one of them. I tried to tell the law that, but they didn't want to hear it, so I'm saying it now, in front of God and everybody. Elias Rowe is innocent." The crowd erupted into noise, voices raised in argument, in support, in outrage. Judge Holloway raised his hand for silence, and slowly, reluctantly, the noise died down. "Marshal Danner," the judge said, his voice hard, "did you investigate this witness's testimony when he first came forward?" Danner's face flushed. "He never came forward, Your Honor, not officially, because you wouldn't listen," Tom Carver said, his voice rising. "You had your man, and you didn't care about the truth. You just wanted someone to hang." "That's enough," Judge Holloway said sharply. He looked down at the confession again, then at Elias, then at Clara. The silence stretched out, taut as a wire, and Clara felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Finally, the judge spoke. "This confession, combined with Mr. Carver's testimony, raises significant doubt about Mr. Rowe's guilt, doubt that should have been investigated before we reached this point." He turned to Danner, and his expression was cold. "Marshal, you will remove Mr. Rowe from the scaffold and return him to a cell while I review this evidence more thoroughly. If what's been presented here today holds up under scrutiny, this case will be dismissed, and Mr. Rowe will be released." The crowd exploded into noise again, some cheering, some protesting. Clara felt her knees go weak, and she grabbed the railing to steady herself. Across the square, Elias was staring at her with an expression she couldn't name, disbelief and gratitude and something raw that made her chest ache. Danner moved to unlock Elias's shackles, his movements stiff and reluctant. But before he could, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "This is a goddamn mockery." A man pushed his way forward, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face like carved granite and eyes burning with fury. Clara recognized him from town, Silas Porter, owner of the bank in Carson Ridge. He'd ridden all this way for the hanging, she realized, to see justice, or what he thought was justice, done. "That man," Porter said, pointing at Elias, "robbed my bank. He shot my clerk, and now you're going to let him walk because of some scribbled confession from a dead man and the word of a drifter? What kind of law is that?" "It's the kind that requires proof, Mr. Porter," Judge Holloway said evenly. "Not vengeance." "Proof?" Porter's voice rose. "I'll tell you what proof is. It's my clerk lying in a grave. It's $10,000 stolen from hard-working people. It's a town living in fear because men like this think they can take whatever they want and hide behind technicalities." He turned to the crowd, his voice carrying across the square. "Is this what we've come to? Letting criminals go free because some widow rides in with a piece of paper? Because some drifter changes his story?" Clara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "That widow has a name, Clara Wynne, and I didn't ride 3 days through the desert to let an innocent man hang because you need someone to blame for your loss." Porter's eyes fixed on her, cold and assessing. "You don't know he's innocent. You only know what he's told you. I know what the evidence says. I know what Jack Henley confessed, and I know that the law is supposed to be about truth, not convenience." Easy words for someone who hasn't lost anything. Clara's jaw tightened. "I lost my husband 2 years ago. I've been alone on that ranch ever since. I know what loss feels like, Mr. Porter, but my loss doesn't give me the right to destroy an innocent man." The silence that followed was heavy and charged. Porter stared at her, his face reddening, and for a moment Clara thought he might come at her. But then Judge Holloway spoke, his voice carrying the weight of authority. This conversation is over. Mr. Rowe will be returned to custody pending my review. The rest of you, clear the square, now." The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, people clustering in small groups to whisper and argue. Clara stood on the courthouse steps, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and relief, and the aftershock of adrenaline. She watched as Danner led Elias back toward the jailhouse. Watched the way Elias looked back at her over his shoulder, his eyes speaking everything his mouth couldn't. "Thank you. I'm sorry. How did you do this?" Clara wanted to run to him, to tell him everything would be all right now, that the nightmare was over, but she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The judge still had to review the evidence. Porter and others like him would still push for a conviction, and even if Elias was released, the stain of suspicion would follow him, but he was alive, and he was off the scaffold. That was enough for now. Clara spent the next 2 days in town, staying at the boarding house and waiting for Judge Holloway's decision. She slept for 16 hours straight the first night, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay through sheer force of will. When she woke, Sable had been fed and groomed by the livery stable owner, who told Clara the mare was the toughest animal he'd ever seen. "Shouldn't have made it the way you rode her," he said, not unkindly, "but she did. That's a horse that'll carry you to hell and back if you ask her." "I know," Clara said quietly. "I already did." On the second day, Sarah Henley came to visit. They sat in the boarding house parlor and drank weak coffee while Sarah told Clara about her life with Jack, the early years when he'd been different, kinder before drink and desperation had turned him into someone she didn't recognize. She cried when she talked about his death, but Clara saw relief there too. Relief that the lies were finally over. "Thank you," Sarah said as she was leaving, "for being brave enough to do what I should have done sooner." "You did it when it mattered," Clara replied. "That's what counts." That evening, Tom Carver found Clara outside the general store and tipped his hat to her. "I hope it's enough," he said. "What we did, what we said." "So do I. You care for him." It wasn't a question. Clara looked away, toward the jailhouse where Elias sat waiting. "I do. Then I hope the judge sees sense. Roe's a good man. Better than most. Deserves a chance to prove it." "Everyone deserves that," Clara said quietly. On the third morning, Judge Holloway sent word that he was ready to render his decision. The courthouse filled again, though the crowd was smaller this time. The spectacle seekers had lost interest, and only those with a real stake remained. Clara sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her heart beating slow and heavy. Elias was brought in, still shackled, and placed at the defendant's table. He looked thinner than he had a week ago, his face gaunt and shadowed. But when his eyes found Clara's, something in them steadied. Judge Holloway entered, and everyone stood. He took his seat behind the bench and arranged his papers with deliberate care. Then he looked up, his expression grave. "I've reviewed the evidence presented by Mrs. Wynne, Mrs. Henley, and Mr. Carver. I've also reviewed the original witness statements and the testimony given at the preliminary hearing. After careful consideration, I've reached a conclusion." The room held its breath. The confession of Jack Henley, corroborated by his widow and supported by Mr. Carver's eyewitness account, creates reasonable doubt about Mr. Rowe's involvement in the Carson Ridge robbery. Moreover, the original identification by the bank clerk was made under extreme duress and cannot be considered reliable, given the circumstances. Clara's hands tightened on the wooden token in her pocket. "It is the finding of this court that Elias Rowe did not participate in the robbery of the Carson Ridge Bank on April 12th. All charges against him are hereby dismissed, and he is to be released immediately." The gavel came down, and the sound echoed through the courthouse like thunder. Clara closed her eyes and tears slipped down her cheeks, tears of relief and exhaustion and gratitude so profound it felt like prayer. Around her, the room erupted into noise. Some people cheered, others grumbled and shook their heads. Silas Porter stood and stormed out, his face dark with fury, but Clara didn't care about any of that, because Elias was standing now, and Danner was unlocking his shackles, and for the first time in a week, Elias Rowe was a free man. Clara rose and moved toward him, and the crowd parted to let her through. When she reached him, he was rubbing his wrists where the iron had bitten into his skin, his eyes still wide with disbelief. "You did it," he said, his voice hoarse. "You actually did it." "We did it," Clara said, "all of us." Elias shook his head slowly. "You rode 3 days into the desert. You found the preacher. You brought back the confession. You stood up here in front of everyone and fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." His voice broke. "Why?" Clara reached out and took his hand, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin, the tremor that ran through both of them. "Because you were worth fighting for," she said simply. Elias stared at her for a long moment, and then, without warning, he pulled her into his arms. Clara went stiff with surprise, then relaxed into the embrace, her face pressed against his chest, feeling his heart beating hard and fast beneath her ear. Around them, people whispered and stared, but Clara didn't care. She'd ridden through hell to bring him home. Let them talk. They left town that afternoon, riding side by side, Elias on the dappled gelding Clara had bought for him, Clara on Sable. The sun was warm on their backs and the land stretched out before them, golden and open and alive with possibility. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, easy, filled with the sound of hoofbeats and wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to. I do. You saved my life, Clara. More than that, you gave me back my name, my future, everything I thought I'd lost." Clara glanced at him, and in the afternoon light he looked different, younger, somehow. The weight of fear and desperation finally lifted from his shoulders. "What will you do now?" she asked. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know. I was heading north before, but I don't think that's where I need to be anymore." "Where do you need to be?" He looked at her, and his eyes were clear and honest. "Wherever you are. If you'll have me." Clara's throat tightened. She thought about the cabin waiting for them in the valley, about the garden they'd planted together, about the quiet rhythm of days spent working side by side. She thought about the loneliness that had filled her life for 2 years, and the way it had slowly and possibly begun to ease. "I'll have you," she said quietly. Elias smiled, a real smile, the first she'd ever seen from him, and it transformed his face completely. They rode on as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose and deep purple. And behind them, the town of Carson Ridge and its scaffold and its judgment faded into memory. Ahead lay only open land and possibility, and the quiet promise of a life built not on what had been lost, but on what had been found. Mercy given freely. Truth fought for fiercely. And 2 people who'd learned that sometimes saving someone else was the only way to save yourself. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara reached into her pocket and felt the wooden token there, smooth and solid and real. And she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than words, that they were finally going home. Summer came to the valley like a benediction, soft and warm and impossibly green. The rains that had arrived with Elias stayed through spring, gentle and persistent, and the land responded as if waking from a long sleep. Grass pushed up through the hardpan, thick and sweet-smelling. Wildflowers scattered across the meadow in waves of yellow and purple and white. The creek that had been dry for 2 years ran clear and cold again, its voice a constant murmur that filled the air with the sound of life returning. Clara stood in the garden she and Elias had planted, her hands dark with soil, and looked at the rows of green pushing up through the earth, beans climbing their stakes, tomatoes heavy with fruit, squash vines spreading across the ground like promises kept. It seemed impossible that only 3 months ago this had been nothing but dust and hope. Now it was food, real food, enough to carry them through the winter and maybe sell some in town. She straightened and pressed her hands to the small of her back, feeling the ache of good work settle into her muscles. The sun was high overhead, warm but not cruel, and a breeze moved through the valley carrying the scent of sage and grass and the distant mountains. "You're going to work yourself into the ground," Elias said behind her. Clara turned. He was walking up from the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his face tanned from weeks in the sun. He'd filled out since that first day she'd found him dying in the canyon, his shoulders broader, his movements easier, the haunted look gone from his eyes. He looked like a man who'd finally stopped running, says the man who rebuilt the entire north fence in 2 days, Clara replied. Elias smiled and came to stand beside her, surveying the garden with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood. what it meant to make something grow from nothing. Fair point. They stood there together, in comfortable silence, and Clara felt the rightness of it settle over her like sunlight. This was what peace felt like, she realized. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of someone to struggle alongside. Not the silence of loneliness, but the quiet of companionship. "Come on," Elias said, touching her elbow lightly. "There's something I want to show you." He led her across the meadow toward the far side of the valley, where the land rose gently toward a stand of cottonwoods that had begun to leaf out in the spring rains. Clara had walked this way 100 times before, but she followed without question, curious and content. When they reached the trees, Elias stopped and gestured toward a small clearing. Clara stepped forward and caught her breath. He'd built a bench. Not just any bench, a real one, crafted from smooth sanded wood, with a curved back and armrests carved with simple, elegant designs. It sat beneath the largest cottonwood, positioned so that anyone sitting there would have a view of the entire valley, the cabin, the barn, the meadow stretching out in waves of green and gold toward the distant hills. Clara moved closer and ran her hand over the wood, feeling the care that had gone into every joint, every curve. "When did you do this?" "Been working on it for a few weeks. Early mornings mostly before you wake up." Elias came to stand beside her, his hands in his pockets, suddenly uncertain. "I wanted to make you something that would last, something that said." He trailed off, searching for words. "Said what?" Clara asked softly. "That I'm staying. That this isn't temporary. That I'm here and I'm not leaving and I want to build something with you. Not just fences and gardens, but a life, a real one." Clara's throat tightened. She looked at the bench, at the valley beyond, at the man who'd come into her life half dead and desperate, and had somehow become the person she couldn't imagine living without. "Sit with me," she said. They sat together on the bench, and it held them easily, solid and sure. From here, Clara could see everything. The cabin where Daniel had died and where she'd learned to live alone. The barn where Sable and the geldings stood in the shade. The creek winding through the meadow like a silver thread. She could see the garden they'd planted, the fences they'd mended, the life they'd begun to build from the ruins of what had been. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Clara asked quietly. "Going north, like you planned?" Elias was quiet for a moment, sometimes not because I want to, but because old habits are hard to break. "I spent so long running that part of me still expects to have to keep moving." He looked at her, "But then I remember why I stayed, and I know I'm exactly where I need to be." "Why did you stay?" "Because you believed. Me when no one else would. Because you fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. Because you showed me what it looks like to have courage that isn't about running towards something or away from it, but just standing firm in the face of everything." He paused. "And because somewhere between that first morning and now, I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and honest and true. Clara felt them settle into her chest, warm and solid, and she realized she'd been waiting to hear them, or maybe waiting to let herself believe them. "I love you too," she said, and the words felt like coming home. Elias reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. They sat like that for a long time, watching the sun move slowly across the sky, watching the shadows lengthen and the light turn golden. Finally, Elias spoke again. "I went into town yesterday." Clara looked at him. "You didn't tell me. I wanted it to be a surprise." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I talked to the land office, asked about buying the parcel of land adjacent to yours, the old Miller property. It's been sitting vacant for years and they were willing to sell it for less than I expected." He unfolded the document and showed it to her. It was a deed, official and stamped, with 2 names written at the top, Clara Wynne and Elias Rowe. Clara stared at it, her eyes blurring with tears. "You bought land? For both of us?" "I had some money saved from before. Not much, but enough. I wanted to do something that showed I'm not just here because I'm grateful, or because I had nowhere else to go. I'm here because I choose to be. Because I want to build a future with you, and I want it to be real. On paper, in the eyes of the law, permanent." He looked at her, and his eyes were bright with emotion. "You lent me your horse when I was dying. You saved my life, and then you saved my name, and then you gave me a home when I had nothing, so I'm giving you this. More land, more possibility, a bigger future." His voice dropped to a whisper. "A new life." Clara's tears spilled over, and she laughed through them, shaking her head in wonder. You bought me a new life. We bought us a new life, Elias corrected gently. Clara set the deed aside carefully and turned to face him. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin, the solid realness of him. Thank you, she said, for staying, for fighting, for choosing this. Thank you, Elias replied, for seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. Clara kissed him then, soft and slow, and it felt like a promise. Not spoken, but lived. When they pulled apart, the sun was beginning to set, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose and deep purple. They stood and walked back toward the cabin hand in hand. And with each step, Clara felt the weight of the past 2 years. The grief, the loneliness, the fear begin to lift. Not disappearing completely, but transforming into something else. Scar tissue, maybe. The kind that marked where you'd been broken but also where you'd healed. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. They rose with the sun and worked through the heat of the day. Elias clearing brush on the new land, Clara tending the garden and the animals. They ate supper together as the light faded, sharing stories and plans and comfortable silences. And at night, they sat on the porch or on the bench beneath the cottonwood and watched the stars emerge, bright and cold and infinite. One evening, as they sat together watching fireflies dance across the meadow, Elias spoke quietly. I've been thinking about what comes next. For us. Clara glanced at him. What do you mean? I mean, we have the land now, we have the cabin, the barn, the animals, we're building something real, but it's just the two of us, and I keep thinking that maybe, someday, it could be more. Clara's breath caught. You mean, I mean a family, children if you want them, or just a life that's bigger than survival, a life that's about thriving, about creating something that lasts beyond us. Clara was quiet for a long moment thinking about Daniel, about the child they'd tried for and lost before he died, about the years she'd spent alone convincing herself that kind of hope was foolish. But sitting here with Elias, with the fireflies glowing like tiny promises in the darkness, it didn't feel foolish. It felt possible. I'd like that, she said softly. Someday, when we're ready. Elias smiled and pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the solid presence of him beside her. We have time, he said, all the time in the world. By late summer, the new land was cleared and ready for planting. Elias had worked himself nearly to exhaustion getting it ready, but Clara had never seen him happier. He moved through the work with purpose and joy, and she realized this was what redemption looked like. Not a single moment of salvation, but the daily choice to build something good from the wreckage of what had been. One afternoon, as they stood together surveying the cleared land, a rider appeared on the ridge. Clara tensed instinctively, old fears rising, but Elias just shaded his eyes and watched the rider approach. It was Marshal Danner. He rode down into the valley slowly, his posture relaxed, and when he reached them, he dismounted and tipped his hat. Afternoon, Clara. Elias. Marshal, Clara said carefully. Something wrong? No, nothing wrong. Just thought I'd ride out and let you know in person. The territorial governor signed off on Elias's full pardon. It's official now. Complete exoneration. Your record's cleared. Elias stared at him, and Clara saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. Thank you, Marshal. Danner nodded. I also wanted to apologize. I should have listened when you first told me he was innocent. Should have investigated more thoroughly before pushing for a trial. I let pressure from the bank and the town cloud my judgment, and that was wrong. You were doing your job, Clara said. I was doing it poorly. Danner looked at Elias. I'm sorry for what you went through, for what I put you through. You're a good man and you deserved better. Elias extended his hand and Danner shook it firmly. Thank you for saying that. After the marshal left, Clara and Elias stood together in the cleared field, watching the dust settle from his horse's departure. The sun was warm on their backs, and the breeze carried the smell of earth and growing things. It's really over, Elias said quietly. All of it. Clara took his hand. No, it's really beginning. Autumn came softly, turning the cottonwoods gold and filling the air with the smell of harvest. Clara and Elias brought in the garden. More food than they could eat, enough to sell in town and put away money for the winter. They reinforced the barn, stocked the larder, and prepared for the cold months ahead. One evening, as the first frost touched the meadow and turned it silver, Elias surprised Clara with something he'd been working on in secret. He led her out to the barn and pushed open the door. Inside, in the glow of lamplight, stood a cradle, beautifully crafted, smooth-sanded, with rockers that curved like smiles. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. "Elias, I know we said someday," he said, suddenly shy, "but I wanted you to know I meant it, that I'm ready, whenever you are." Clara crossed to him and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "I'm ready too." They stood there in the barn holding each other, while outside the stars wheeled overhead and the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent and full of promise. Winter came and went, and spring returned to the valley. The meadow greened again, the creek ran high with snowmelt, and one morning in early April, Clara woke to the sound of a newborn foal taking its first steps in the barn. Sable's foal, strong and healthy and full of life. Clara stood in the barn doorway, Elias beside her, and watched the foal explore its new world on wobbly legs. Sable watched too, patient and protective, and Clara thought about the day she'd found Elias dying in the canyon, about how she'd lifted him onto this same mare and brought him home. One act of mercy, given without expectation, one life saved, and from that single choice everything else had grown. Love and partnership cleared land and planted gardens, a future built from the ashes of the past. "She's beautiful," Elias said, nodding toward the foal. "She is... what should we name her?" Clara thought for a moment, then smiled. "Hope." Elias looked at her and smiled too, and in his eyes she saw everything they'd been through and everything they'd become. Two people who'd learned that mercy, once given, never died. That it multiplied, echoed, spread outward in ways you couldn't predict or control. That one woman lending a horse to a dying stranger could change everything. They stood there together, as the sun climbed higher, warming the valley, turning the meadow gold. And in that moment, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years, complete and certain peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of remembering what mattered. Not the peace of being alone, but the peace of being known. They walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, the foal's first steps echoing behind them, and Clara looked out at the valley, at the land they'd cleared, the home they'd rebuilt, the future they were creating together. And she knew, with the kind of certainty that went deeper than words, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The bench beneath the cottonwood would weather many seasons. The garden would be planted and harvested year after year. Children would eventually run through the meadow, their laughter carrying across the valley like music. And long after Clara and Elias were gone, the land would remember what they'd built here. Not wealth, not fame, just mercy, given freely and returned 1,000-fold. Just two people who'd found each other in the dust and the desperation, and who'd chosen, again and again, to stay. And beyond the meadow, beyond the hills, beyond the horizon where the sky met the earth, the wind carried their story, a whisper of hope that traveled far and wide, reminding anyone who heard it that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can become the foundation of an entire life. That mercy, once given, never dies. It only grows. Years later, when visitors came to the valley and asked about the bench beneath the cottonwood, about the garden that always seemed to thrive even in drought years, about the family that lived there with such evident contentment, the townsfolk would tell them the story, about the widow who'd found a dying stranger, about the horse she'd lent him that saved his life, about how he'd bought her not just land, but a new beginning, and about how mercy given without expectation had transformed two broken people into something whole. The story would be told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, but the heart of it remained the same, that love born from compassion was the strongest kind, and that the best way to save yourself was sometimes to save someone else first. And in the evenings, when the light turned gold and the shadows grew long, if you walked past that bench beneath the cottonwood, you might see two figures sitting there, older now, weathered by time and work, but still side by side, still together, watching the sun set over the valley they'd built together, still keeping the promise they'd made to each other all those years ago, to stay, to build, to live a life worth the mercy that had saved them both. And if the wind was right, you might hear them laughing, soft and easy, the sound of two people who'd found their way home at last.